Hi, my name is Nick, and I'm the founder of Doctave, and today I'm going to be showing you Dossier. So Dossier is a multi-language source code and docstrings parser. And what that means is you give Dossier as input some source code, and Dossier will output JSON that describes that source code. So look at all of your classes, your types, your interfaces, and the associated documentation or docstrings, and it will present that information to you in a unified JSON format. So Dossier is still at an early alpha, and we support Typescript and Python at this stage. And Dossier is also built with TreeSitter, which allows us to be multi-language easily, and it's written in Rust. So let's take a look at how it works and jump into a demo. So first, let's take a look at Typescript. I have this very simple program in Typescript. It defines two things. The first one being a user type. It has some documentation for it. And it has a getUser function that takes in a string as name, and it returns a user type that we just described up here. And note that we don't actually care about the internals of the function because Dossier doesn't actually look at the internals of any functions. We only care about the signatures of various things in your program. So if I pipe this into, or give this as an input to Dossier, we get a bunch of JSON out as we expect. And I'm going to pipe this into a tool called FX so that we can inspect the output a little bit easier. So the first thing we get here is this user type alias that we described. There's the documentation. Every type, or every named entity rather, in Dossier gets a fully qualified name, which is computed based on the entity's location and scope in the program. Now, each entity can then have members, or kind of child entities. And the type alias here was describing an object, so that is its child member. The object itself has child members, namely the properties that it was describing. And finally, at the very end, we get the types that actually the properties have, or are kind of the final leaf entities in this tree. Now, if we go further on, we get to the user function, the getUser function. There's the documentation, of course. It has its own fully qualified name. And this times it has two members. The first one being the parameter, which is the name string that it was taking in as an input. And here's where things get interesting. As the return type, we have this identifier referring to this user type. And Dossier has actually been able to to figure out that this is referring to this user type, that alias that we just saw earlier. So we can actually do type resolution in Dossier. And this is without using the TypeScript runtime or any sort of JavaScript runtime whatsoever. So instead, what we've done is we've re-implemented some of the rules from TypeScript in Rust using TreeSitter, and we're able to do this at least as a limited subset of what TypeScript does. And this is incredibly useful if we want to do linking to various parts of documentation, if you're using Dossier to create documentation, or if you just want to run some analysis on your source code and figure out, well, what are all the places that actually this one particular type is being referenced. It's incredibly, incredibly powerful. Okay, so let's move on. Okay, so I said that Dossier is multi-language, so I'm going to prove that to you now. So we also have this very simple Python program here, and it's describing this silly dog. Very simple Python class, just has two methods and some associated documentation with them. I'm going to do the same thing again. I'm going to pass this into Dossier, and we get some JSON output. And it is in fact the same structure as before, but this time describing a Python class. And really the idea is that we want to have one single schema to describe entities in all kinds of languages. And that admittedly is no small task, but it's going to be a very powerful future if we can actually achieve that goal, because now you'll have one tool chain to really analyze any kind of source code you have. Now, you might be looking at this and thinking to yourself, Nick, those are very simple programs. Can you actually parse something more complicated like real software? And yes, we can. So TypeScript is the language where we have the most coverage at this point. And this is the Kysely TypeScript library. Yes, that is how you pronounce it. It's a Finnish word. Kysely is an ORM/query builder in TypeScript. It's a fairly complicated library and has some quite gnarly type signatures in it, as you can imagine. And we're going to pass it over to Dossier and see what happens. So it takes a while to render everything, but in the end, we process about 247 files in 57 milliseconds. And this included also doing all the type resolution within files and also across imports, which is very, very cool. And this is very verbose output at the moment. I believe it's about, just under 300,000 lines. But this is just to show that Dossier can actually parse already today some fairly complicated programs. So if you found this interesting, you can find us on GitHub. Hope you take a look yourself and try out Dossier on your own programs. And if you find any issues or you want to contribute, yeah, find us on GitHub. Thanks very much.